Yes, there's now a red button has appeared in. Oh, I've also got transcription. I really don't want to see that. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming to our EDI seminar today. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our speaker, Professor Prajval Shastri, who I've known for a number of years now. Prajval is an astrophysicist. She says how many decades, but we needn't say just how many. But quite a while. She investigates the physics of giant black holes, and she gave an excellent talk. If you remember, it was the Nobel Prize. Was that 2 years ago to Andrea Gaim and people on black holes and her very topic. And Prajval gave an excellent talk on the Nobel Prize, the winners and the physics that they were doing. So she got her PhD from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Then she had some postdoc positions at the University of Texas at Austin, University of California at Berkeley, and the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. She then became a faculty of the Indian Institute of Astrophysics at Bengaluru. Is that how you pronounce it? Bengaluru, in India, for again a goodly number of years, shall we say. She's been a Fulbright Fellow at Stanford University and is currently Emeritus Scientist at the Raman Research Institute and Adjunct Professor at the International Centre for Radio Astronomy Research in Australia. So as well as all her physics, she's been extremely passionate about outreach and also particularly about sort of women in physics and sort of gender in science. And she's been on the working group, the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, where I got to know Prajval. We were both working on that, and she's currently the vice chair of that Women in Physics working group of IUPAP. So she has published numerous articles, including also popular articles on astrophysics, and also provides articles on sort of gender equity or inequity and science and society. So it's a real pleasure to hear Prajval talking to us today about intersectionality. So I shall hand over to you, Prajval, and I shall just now try and share this the right screen.
Thanks very much, Julian, and thank you very much. It's a real honor and privilege to address this audience. I was actually very inspired to look at the University of Leicester website, which talked about our world as a work in progress and how we, with our education, must be citizens of change. And so the status quo is simply not on, clearly, which is really inspiring. So, yeah, I'm requesting control. Right, I think I have it. So I was encouraged to start with talking about my own journey through science and the lessons from it. So that is what I will do. So I work on black holes, the physics of black holes. And as we know, black holes are chunks of space-time from which even light cannot escape. And the smallest black holes that we know are, is the slide changing?
This slide has changed for me, yes. We're on to the Oppenheimer and Volkoff.
Okay, I wanted to actually skip this. So the smallest black holes we know are cosmic. Heavy stars collapse into black holes at the quote-unquote end of their lives. But the black holes that, and they are strewn all across the Milky Way and all across other galaxies, but the black holes that I work on are much, much bigger. And they're different from these stellar mass black holes because they're found in the centers of galaxies. They're much, much bigger, 1 million times or even 1 billion times the mass of our sun. And the other thing is that their formation is probably happening in a very different way from the stellar mass black holes, because they're always found in the centers of these galaxies. And they were first discovered many decades ago because they spewed out these enormous jets of plasma from the centers of the galaxies, which went out into intergalactic space. Like this example and many other examples we know of. And of course, one of the very exciting results that has accumulated over the past 2 decades is that at the center of our very own Milky Way, dynamical evidence has accumulated for a giant black hole in the center. So here on the right is an example from my own work, which is actually a remnant of 2 merging galaxies, and therefore 2 merging or merging in the future giant black holes. But in the center of our own Milky Way, there was dynamical evidence found for a giant black hole 4 million solar masses. And for some reason, my animation is not playing. Okay, because it's a PDF. Okay, but I'm sure you've seen this animation many times before. And very, very recently, a few weeks ago, there was this other exciting result that independently corroborated the idea of a supermassive black hole by actually imaging its silhouette. So the dynamical evidence for a giant black hole, which was by Andrea Ghez and Reinhard Genzel and their teams, won the Nobel Prize in 2020. What was interesting is that Andrea Ghez, when she submitted her thesis back in 1993, she said that she dedicated it to all the women scientists she had known. Why was this? She also has said, I grew up hearing the word no all the time. You're a girl, you can't do it. You're a girl, there's no way you can get into MIT, etc. Now, if I personally had heard this half a century ago when I was growing up, I would have been surprised, because I was born in 58, a year after Sputnik was launched. Science was very thick in the air. Valentina Tereshkova and Yuri Gagarin were my childhood heroes. I got this book from my parents at age 8, which described Rutherford's gold foil experiment. I was completely floored by that. I also read this book by W.W. Sawyer called The Mathematician's Delight. I mean, a couple of different books by him, which I think are the most popular math teaching books ever. I certainly got a very intuitive feel for mathematics with them, so mathematics never seemed inaccessible. I, of course, read Marie Curie's biography. I also read a lot of Soviet science fiction. Those days, we had these books available in India at very cheap rates, both science fiction and actual science. And so it didn't seem particularly strange for me to actually be interested and passionate about science and aspire to actually do science. In school and in my college, I went to a girls' school, a girls' college. So in my girls' school, the only men teachers I had were for music and dance and language. All other teachers, whether science, mathematics, physics, games, were all women. And in college, it was very mixed. So the only PhD lecturer in my college was a woman. I had 2 Roman Catholic nuns who were my professors, one for physics, one for mathematics. So I never experienced gender inequity within the educational space. Of course, one saw it all around one. I mean, in society, it was in our face. But I somehow thought of the educational space as different, as something where it was for everyone. It was only when I went for my master's to an elite institution that I began to see that the gender equity in outside society was also getting mirrored within. And it sort of reflected the kind of statements that Andrea Ghez made that I showed in my earlier slides. So, as we all know, there were very, very few Nobel Prizes in physics for women until 2020. And there were many path-breaking scientists who happened to be women who did astonishing work but did not get the Nobel Prize. So does the fact that Andrea Ghez got the prize in 2020, 2 years after Strickland got the prize in 2018, does that mean that now physics is ungendered? Not really, because most people's reaction is how amazing that a woman got it, whereas it should have been simply how amazing that science is. So we still have a long way to go. And the numbers tell the same story. So across the globe, segregated statistics in the gender binary framework show us that there is a huge gender gap in physics. And of course, we all know that physics is among the worst of the disciplines when it comes to the gender gap. The underrepresentation shows up in virtually every country data that one looks at. For India, the data show that there is no evidence for a lack of interest in science among girls. They win the national level scholarships, both for physics and for overall science, as many as the boys do, or the men do. And nevertheless, if you look at, if you look at the data for professional scientists, as early as 2001, there was evidence that despite the productivity being similar between men and women, they were at lower echelons on the hierarchy. They had to wait longer to get to higher positions. This was despite the fact that there was no productivity deficit and there was no competence deficit. And if you looked at the fraction of women with PhDs in physics, for example, who were employed in higher education, that was about 20% a couple of years ago, which is already low. But then if you go to fractions of women among academy fellows or prestigious lectures or governing council positions, it just drops to really pathetic numbers. So clearly, there are barriers within our enterprise. It's not merely because there are barriers in outside society. And as to the question of whether discriminatory familial responsibilities on women is responsible for the gender gap, it may be so, and there is some evidence that that might be one reason, but it's certainly not the only reason or the whole story, because the gender gap for all sciences is much, much lower than for physics. So this clearly tells us that there are barriers within the enterprise. So what are the mechanisms through which these barriers operate? I want to quote Meg Urey, which kind of says it all. She said, discrimination isn't a thunderbolt. It isn't an abrupt slap in the face. It's the slow drumbeat of being underappreciated, feeling uncomfortable, and encountering roadblocks along the path to success. So really, that is the problem that one is facing. I'm sorry, I'm seeing a blank screen.
Yes, it's showing blank. Right, move on. What's that?
I'm trying to move on. Ah.
Is that?
Okay, I think I missed a couple of slides. Or maybe the slide is blank. That is strange. Okay, I think I will just read out what I meant to say. So what I meant to say, I'm sorry about that blank slide, but what I meant to say there is that at the root of this is the fact that gender is actually a social construct. So a social construct is something that does not exist in nature, but is invented by society, and we all act as if it exists, and by our tacit agreement, it does exist. And gender is just one example of that. And so one really needs to get to the bottom of that in order to tackle the root causes for the gender gap. So for example, in the USA, 50% of bus drivers almost are women. But in India, the social construct dictates that women don't drive buses. So virtually in the whole country, there's just a handful of women who are actually bus drivers. A bus driver makes news. So that is why this is one of my prized photographs, because this is me with Mamata, who's a bus driver in Bengaluru, who came to listen to my discussion on science in 2019. And the common pathway is that one should give support to the marginalized groups as needed by the marginalized groups. So the panel on the left shows equal size stools, and that is not the right way to go. One should give the height of stool should be proportionate to what is required, and that is called equity. However, the ultimate goal, of course, is to root out the root cause or the systemic barrier. In this case, that's what's seen on the rightmost panel. But one must remember that social constructs can lead to systemic barriers in unexpected ways. So for example, the barrier can actually depend on the identity of the person experiencing it. And therefore, social scientists are absolutely critical in the discussion when we design interventions to tackle the status quo. What happens when we do a deep dive into the evidence? For example, in the Indian context, we see that it is not only gender, which is the identity that causes marginalization, but caste as well plays a major role. Unfortunately, the data are not extensive on this, but I'm quoting a couple of examples that have delved into this question. So if you do look at who are the successive women scientists who are practicing science, they all tend to be from upper caste. So clearly, women need cultural capital in order to survive in the enterprise. And so each of us may experience discrimination along multiple dimensions, and all of those need to be considered, and that's exactly what is intersectionality. And of course, the dimensions are multiple, as I said, so they could be age, ability, sexual orientation, class, etc. And their intersection needs to be considered. This is one of my favorite cartoons. It's a Six Chicks cartoon, which says, "What on earth is white privilege?" And the answer is not knowing what it is to start with. So I think that kind of encapsulates the invisibility of discrimination along dimensions that each of us may not experience because of our privilege. So at the 7th IUPAC International Conference for Women, we organized a workshop on intersectionality. in order to unpack this idea. So this was an interactive workshop. This was actually the second that we had. The first one was in 2017 in Birmingham at the same conference series in Birmingham. And at the sort of core of this was this idea that was articulated beautifully by Fannie Lou Hamer, which says the truth is no one of us can be free until everybody is free. So one of the first things we did, we tried to get participants to do with us, was to map each of our identities. So identities are about the way we think and the kind of people we want to be. So this idea of a diversity wheel or identity wheel is quite useful. Here is an example that was created by the Johns Hopkins University. So it shows the inner wheel, which are kind of dimensions that we kind of don't change or are set, for example, age or national origin. But some of these are also likely to change and be fluid. And then on the outer side, again, are things that are likely to change, but will definitely influence how we think about ourselves and how others think about us. So we got people to map their multiple identities, which means first you have to identify the different identities that each of us carries. And then we all of us try to explore how some of these identities are disadvantaging, but others give us privilege. And discovering that privilege is most often invisible to the privileged. So this was an important part of this exercise. And then we try to look at what the evidence tells us. Once we had done this, we try to take a few examples which are commonly advocated as interventions to mitigate inequity, in particular gender inequity. And then try to ask the question, does it really serve the purpose of equity? Does it really include everyone, or does it land up excluding people? So the examples we chose were more maternity leave for women. This is a very commonly advocated intervention. More toilets for women in buildings, affirmative action, and quotas. So for example, we went into breakout groups and each group tackled one of these interventions and tried to explore and imagine and put oneself in the shoes of others to imagine who does it then benefit and who does it exclude. So for example, more maternity leave for women obviously would exclude benefits for the other parent. So for fathers, for instance, or for people who build families through adoption, or even people who have family responsibilities. They may not be babies, but they may be other family responsibilities. And this does not take that into account at all. Whereas if one thinks about it, family responsibilities, having babies is like any other family responsibilities. Similarly, more toilets for women. If you unpack that, it becomes clear that having gender neutral toilets is a much better intervention because it not only addresses the problem of a paucity of toilets for women, but it also benefits people with disabilities. So that's another recommendation that came out of this exercise of looking at whether more toilets for women itself was the right way to go. One of the lessons from this exercise was that it was really important to create a safe space for dialogue in order for this kind of discussion to happen and in order that reasonable recommendations emerge. So we try to come up with recommendations for the classroom, for the department, for conferences, for editorial boards, journalists, and science museums. The point is that there are no specific answers. Each of these do need dialogue, they need discussion, they need consideration of multiple voices. They also need centering of the most marginalized while imagining a climate and a space that is enabling and welcoming for everybody. So some of the example recommendations are just up here. For instance, for the department, gender-neutral bathrooms, washrooms was a major one. Maternity leave transformed into family leave was another. EDI work should be incentivized, resourced, and valued. This was really important. Because normally what happens is that it is seen as a sort of a, it is seen as a sort of a social service, and then it lands up being the responsibility of the marginalized groups rather than becoming everybody's work. So that is the other recommendation, number 7. Mechanisms should be in place to minimize burdening equity deserving groups with equity work. So equity work should be everyone's work. Sorry, this was another example was a way to make conferences welcoming to people of all genders. So typically conferences have a registration box, and at least in India, they now they have 3. They used to have only 2 boxes. Now they have 3. Something like this with many more options, including the option to self-describe, preference not to describe, etc. But also, quite importantly, rather than just ask for gender, if the question is, what gender do you identify with? That can signal a much more welcoming environment to potential participants. So I wanted to end by actually thanking my collaborators who organized the workshop, but also with Lila Thompson's quote, which says, "If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." So I'll stop here and take questions.
Thanks, Prajval. So what I'm going to do, shall I stop sharing the screen? Unless we can go back if people want to see anything, but we'll come back to that. I should also, at this point, I shall stop the recording so that if we want to sort of have discussion, then people feel that they are able to do so without it actually being recorded. So I'll just stop that, hopefully. I've pressed a button. Okay, I pressed the button, but nothing happened. Stop. I'll try. Stop.